My father made me sign a contract at age 8 promising perfect grades, and at 17 he tried to sue me for breach of contract. The contract sat on the kitchen table between my bowl of cereal and my father's briefcase. I was 8 years old and didn't understand most of the words printed on the thick paper with the official-looking header that read, Academic Performance Agreement. My father pointed to the signature line at the bottom with his Mont Blanc pen. Sign here, Nathan. This is how successful families operate. We document expectations and consequences. My mother stood behind him with her arms folded, nodding in agreement. I asked what would happen if I didn't sign it. My father's expression didn't change. Then you'll learn that refusing to meet reasonable expectations has costs. No allowance, no birthday parties, no friends over. Sign it, and we can all move forward as a proper family unit. I signed my name in the careful block letters I'd been practicing in 2nd grade. My father witnessed it, added his signature, then slid the document into a leather folder and locked it in his desk. This contract states you will maintain a 4.0 grade point average through high school graduation. Any grade below an A constitutes breach of contract. The consequences are outlined in Section 3, Subsection B. You can review it anytime you need a reminder of what we expect from you. I nodded even though I didn't know what breach or subsection meant. My mother handed me my backpack and told me the school bus would be there in 5 minutes. I left for school with a strange heaviness in my chest that I couldn't name yet. The contract lived in my father's office for 9 years, but its presence governed everything I did. Every homework assignment was checked by my father before submission. Every test was reviewed in detail during what he called performance analysis sessions at the dinner table. When I brought home a 94 on a science quiz in 4th grade, my father pulled out the contract and read aloud from Section 3. A grade below 95% is considered substandard performance. You'll spend this weekend writing an analysis of what went wrong and how you'll prevent it in the future. No screen time until the analysis is submitted and approved. I spent Saturday and Sunday writing 5 pages about not studying my vocabulary words thoroughly enough. My father graded my analysis and gave it an 87. I had to rewrite it. By middle school, I'd learned to operate within the system my father had created. I studied constantly, memorized everything, asked teachers for extra credit opportunities before assignments were even graded. My friends started calling me the robot because I never hung out after school and always left lunch early to review notes. My best friend Leo tried to get me to come to his birthday party in 7th grade. I wanted to go desperately, but I had a history test the following Monday. Just come for an hour, Leo said. You already know this stuff better than the teacher. But I couldn't risk it. My father's contract didn't have exceptions for social events. I stayed home and studied while Leo's party happened without me. The first real breach happened in 9th grade during biology. Mrs. Thornton assigned a group project worth 40% of our grade, and I got partnered with 2 students who didn't care about school. I did all the work, created the entire presentation, but on presentation day, one of my partners showed up high and derailed everything by making jokes instead of following the script I'd written. Mrs. Thornton gave us a B+ for lack of cohesion and professionalism. I felt my world collapse. That night, my father called me into his office and laid the contract on the desk between us. You signed this 9 years ago. You agreed to maintain perfect grades. You've breached the contract. His voice was calm, measured, the same tone he used with clients at his law firm. It wasn't my fault, I said, and my voice cracked. I did all the work. My partners ruined it. My father opened a legal pad and began writing. The contract doesn't include provisions for external factors. You're responsible for your grade, regardless of circumstances. Section 4. Subsection C addresses remediation for breach. You'll write a formal apology to me and your mother for failing to uphold your commitment. You'll also forfeit all privileges for the next semester. No phone, no computer except for homework, no social activities. Additionally, you'll attend Saturday tutoring sessions I'll arrange with a private biology tutor to ensure this doesn't happen again. I tried to argue that I already had an A in biology overall, that one group project didn't change that, but my father held up the contract. This document is legally binding. You signed it voluntarily. I suggest you accept the consequences and move forward. The tutoring sessions cost $200 per week. My father kept receipts in a file labeled Nathan Remediation Costs and told me I'd be repaying him once I started working. The tutor, a graduate student named Amanda, seemed confused about why I was there. You clearly understand this material, she said during our 3rd session. Your dad said you're failing biology, but you're explaining cellular respiration better than most college students. I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't actually failing, that my father had created a system where a B+ counted as failure, that a contract I'd signed at 8 years old was governing my teenage life. Amanda eventually stopped questioning it and just took my father's money while I solved practice problems I didn't need. Sophomore year, I maintained my 4.0 by sacrificing everything else. I quit the baseball team I'd played on since Little League because practice interfered with study time. I stopped accepting invitations from friends who eventually stopped inviting me. I ate lunch in the library reviewing notes. My guidance counselor, Mr. Okafor, called me in one day and asked if everything was okay at home. Your teachers say you seem stressed. Your grades are perfect, Nathan. You can breathe a little. I told him I was fine, that I just took school seriously. He looked at me with concern but didn't push further. I wanted to tell him about the contract, about my father's remediation files, about how I hadn't hung out with friends in 2 years. But the words wouldn't come. My father had made it clear that family business stayed in the family. Junior year started perfectly. I had straight A's through the first semester and was on track for valedictorian. My father actually seemed pleased during our performance analysis sessions, noting that I'd corrected course after the 9th grade breach incident. Then came AP Chemistry with Dr. Vance, who had a reputation for being brilliant but impossibly difficult. His tests were college level, and he curved nothing. The class average was usually around 75%. On the second test of the semester, I got an 89. The highest grade in the class was 91. Dr. Vance told us we should be proud if we scored above 85. I went home knowing what was coming. My father's face, when I showed him the test, was something I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but cold disappointment. An 89 is a B, he said quietly. That's the second breach of your contract. I tried to explain about Dr. Vance's grading system, about how an 89 was actually exceptional in that class, about how I'd studied for weeks and knew the material perfectly. My father pulled out the contract and his remediation files. I've invested tens of thousands of dollars in your education. Private tutors, academic resources, SAT prep courses, all predicated on your contractual agreement to maintain perfect grades. You've now breached twice. The financial and emotional damages are substantial. He began calculating numbers on his legal pad, adding up every tutor session, every prep course, every educational expense since I was 8. The total came to $43,000. You're going to sue me? I asked, and I couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. My father set down his pen. I'm documenting damages in case legal action becomes necessary. You signed a binding agreement, Nathan. In the real world, contracts have consequences. I'm teaching you a valuable lesson about accountability. My mother sat next to him, silent, her hands folded in her lap. I looked at her desperately, hoping she'd intervene, say this was crazy, protect me. She looked away. Your father knows what's best, she said quietly. You just need to try harder. I walked upstairs to my room feeling something break inside me that I didn't know how to fix. Dr. Vance's class got harder. The next test, I got an 87, then an 86. I was studying 6 hours a day, seeing a chemistry tutor 3 times a week, doing every extra credit opportunity, but Dr. Vance's tests were designed to challenge college students, not high schoolers. The class average was dropping into the 60s. Half the students had already dropped to regular chemistry. My father's remediation file was growing thicker. He'd started documenting every imperfect grade, every tutoring session cost, every failure to meet contractual obligations. When I brought home my progress report showing a B in chemistry, my father told me he'd consulted with his law firm about breach of contract litigation. You're actually going to sue me, I said. And this time, it wasn't a question. My father pulled out a document his paralegal had prepared. I'm exploring legal remedies for your breach. You've cost this family over $50,000 in educational investments based on a promise you've repeatedly broken. The contract clearly outlines expectations and consequences. You're 17 now, old enough to be held accountable in civil court for your commitments. He slid the document across the table. It was a demand letter, formally requesting I remedy my breach by achieving perfect grades for the remainder of the year or face litigation for damages. I read it twice, trying to process that my father had involved his law firm, had his staff draft legal documents against his own son, was threatening to sue me for getting B's in an objectively difficult class. I went to school the next day and sat through classes in a fog. During lunch, Leo found me in the library and sat down without asking. We hadn't really talked in years, not since I'd become the robot who never did anything except study. You look terrible, he said. What's going on? Something in his voice broke through my defenses, and I told him everything. About the contract I'd signed at 8, about my father's remediation files and cost calculations, about the demand letter threatening to sue me for breach of contract. Leo listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger. That's insane. You can't sue a kid for getting B's. That contract isn't real, Nathan. You were 8 years old. But I'd believed it was real for 9 years. I'd structured my entire life around that contract, sacrificed friendships and hobbies and any semblance of normal teenage life because I thought I was legally bound to maintain perfection. Leo pulled out his phone and started Googling. Contracts signed by minors aren't enforceable. You can't consent to legal agreements when you're 8. Your dad's a lawyer, he knows this. He's been lying to you. I watched Leo show me article after article about contract law and minor consent, and something in my brain started rewiring itself. My father had used his legal knowledge not to protect me, but to manipulate me into believing I was bound by an agreement that had never been valid. He'd created a system of control based on fake legal authority. I went home that afternoon and walked straight into my father's office without knocking. He was on a phone call with a client and held up a finger indicating I should wait. I didn't wait. The contract isn't real, I said loudly enough that he had to excuse himself from the call. You know contracts signed by minors aren't enforceable. You're a lawyer. You've known for 9 years that contract was meaningless. My father set down his phone carefully. Lower your voice. We'll discuss this when I'm not working. But I couldn't lower my voice. 9 years of perfect grades and sacrificed friendships and constant anxiety were flooding out. You lied to me. You made me believe I was legally obligated to be perfect. You've controlled my entire childhood with a fake contract. My father stood up behind his desk. That contract taught you discipline and accountability. Look at your transcript. You're valedictorian. You're getting into a top university. You should be thanking me for pushing you to excellence. I stared at him and saw something I'd never seen clearly before. He wasn't trying to help me succeed. He was trying to create a perfect product he could point to as evidence of his superior parenting. I was a project, a resume item, proof of his control. I'm not signing anything else, I said. I'm not following that contract anymore. And if you try to sue me, I'll tell the court you manipulated a child with fake legal documents for 9 years. My father's expression hardened. Get out of my office. We'll discuss your attitude when you're ready to apologize. I walked out and went straight to Mr. Okafor's office at school the next morning. He listened to the entire story, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Nathan, what your father did is called coercive control. It's a form of emotional abuse. The contract was never legal, but he used your trust in him as an authority figure to make you believe it was. We need to report this. I felt panic rise in my chest. Reporting my father meant destroying my family, losing my home, facing consequences I couldn't predict. But Mr. Okafor was already picking up his phone. This is my job. I'm a mandatory reporter. When a student discloses abuse, I have to act on it. Child Protective Services came to my house that evening. A social worker named Diana Fuentes interviewed me separately from my parents, asking detailed questions about the contract, the remediation costs, the threat of litigation. I showed her the demand letter my father had given me. She photographed it along with the original contract I retrieved from my father's office. When she interviewed my father, I could hear his voice through the door, calm and reasonable, explaining that he'd simply been teaching me accountability, that all successful families have high expectations, that the contract was a motivational tool, not real legal enforcement. Diana asked to see his remediation files. His hesitation told me everything. The files contained 9 years of documentation, every grade below perfect, every tutoring cost, every breach incident with notes about my failures and his interventions. Diana spent an hour reviewing them, taking photos of page after page. When she finished, she told my parents she'd be filing a report about emotional abuse and coercive control. My father immediately switched into lawyer mode, explaining that nothing he'd done was illegal, that parents have the right to set high expectations, that his methods had produced a straight-A student on track for valedictorian. Diana cut him off. You created a system of psychological control using fraudulent legal documents to manipulate your minor child. That's abuse. The report is being filed tonight. My father hired a family defense attorney named Gregory Blum, who argued that my father's parenting methods were strict but not abusive, that the contract was clearly symbolic, that no reasonable person would believe an 8-year-old could enter a binding legal agreement. But the demand letter was real, written on law firm letterhead, threatening actual litigation. The remediation files were real, documenting 9 years of calculated control. The $50,000 in tracked expenses was real, money my father intended to collect from me somehow. Gregory argued my father never intended to actually sue me, that the demand letter was just motivation. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman named Claudia Reyes, asked why motivation required law firm letterhead and documented damages. The case moved slowly through family court. I stayed with Leo's family while the investigation proceeded. His parents treated me with careful kindness, giving me space, but making sure I ate and slept and went to school. Dr. Vance heard about what was happening and called me into his office after class. I had no idea you were under this pressure. Your 89 on that test was one of the best scores I've seen in 5 years of teaching this course. You understand chemistry better than most graduate students. Whatever your father made you believe, you're not failing anything. I started crying right there in his classroom, 9 years of pressure releasing at once. Dr. Vance pulled up a chair and waited patiently until I could breathe again. The court ordered a psychological evaluation. The psychologist, Dr. Raymond Kim, spent hours interviewing me about my childhood, my relationship with my father, the impact of the contract system. He asked about my social life, my hobbies, my friends. I realized I didn't have answers to most of his questions. I'd spent 9 years studying and nothing else. Dr. Kim's report concluded that I showed signs of complex psychological trauma from sustained emotional abuse. He described the contract system as sophisticated manipulation designed to create dependence and control. He noted that my father's use of legal language and documentation was particularly damaging because it exploited my natural trust in parental authority and gave the abuse a veneer of legitimacy. My mother was called to testify during the hearing. She sat in the witness box looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Claudia Reyes asked why she'd allowed the contract system to continue for 9 years. My mother's voice was barely audible. I thought we were helping him. My husband is so successful. I trusted his judgment about parenting. He said this was how you raise achievers. Claudia showed her the remediation files, the demand letter, the documented costs. Did you think threatening to sue your teenage son was helping him? My mother started crying. I didn't know it had gone that far. I should have stopped it. I should have protected him. She looked at me from the witness stand. I'm sorry, Nathan. I failed you. My father testified in his own defense. He sat in the witness box in his expensive suit, presenting the same calm authority he used in court for his clients. He explained that he'd created the contract as a teaching tool, that high expectations produce high achievers, that his methods had worked because I was valedictorian with a perfect SAT score and acceptance letters from multiple Ivy League schools. Claudia Reyes let him talk himself into a corner. Then she pulled out the demand letter. Is this a teaching tool? Law firm letterhead? Formal legal language? Explicit threat of litigation? You drafted this document using your professional resources to intimidate your teenage son into perfect compliance. That's not parenting. That's coercion. My father tried to argue that teenagers need motivation, that the demand letter was symbolic, that he never would have actually filed a lawsuit. Claudia showed him the remediation files where he'd calculated damages and consulted with his firm about litigation strategy. You documented everything necessary to file suit. You involved your paralegal in drafting formal legal documents against your son. You created a paper trail for a case you now claim was never real. Which is it? Were you planning to sue your child, or were you lying to him to control his behavior? My father's composure finally cracked. I wanted him to succeed. Everything I did was for his future. I gave him every advantage. Claudia's voice was sharp. You gave him trauma. You stole his childhood. You convinced him he was legally obligated to be perfect. That's not parenting. That's abuse. The judge was a man in his 60s named Arthur Pennington, who'd presided over family court for 20 years. He read through Dr. Kim's psychological evaluation, the remediation files, the contract, and the demand letter before delivering his ruling. I've seen many cases of parents with unreasonable expectations. This goes far beyond that. Mr. Reeves, you're an attorney. You understand contract law, minor consent, and legal capacity. You deliberately created a fraudulent legal framework to control your son, exploiting his childhood trust to enforce compliance. You tracked costs and damages as if your child were a debtor rather than a family member. You involved your law firm in drafting threats against your teenage son. This is calculated systematic emotional abuse. Judge Pennington ordered supervised visitation only, pending completion of a year-long parenting course and psychological evaluation of my father. He ordered my father to pay for my therapy costs. He invalidated the contract and all associated documents, formally declaring them void. He ordered the remediation files destroyed. Most significantly, he granted me emancipation. At 17, I became legally independent from parents who'd turned family life into contract litigation. My father sat frozen at the defense table while Gregory Blum gathered papers. My mother was crying quietly in the gallery. I felt nothing but exhausted relief. Leo's parents offered to let me stay until graduation. I accepted gratefully and spent the next months rebuilding something resembling a normal senior year. I joined Leo and his friends for lunch. I went to a party for the first time since middle school. I got a B on a calculus test and felt brief panic, then remembered there was no contract, no remediation file, no consequences, except learning from my mistakes. The B didn't define me. It was just one grade in one class, insignificant in the scope of an actual life. Dr. Vance saw me in the hallway after I got that calculus grade and asked if I was okay. I told him I was better than okay. I was free. My father sent letters through his attorney requesting reconciliation meetings. I declined through my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Huang, who'd been appointed to represent me during the emancipation process. Patricia advised that I wasn't obligated to have any relationship with my parents if I didn't want one, that healing from abuse sometimes required distance. My mother sent emails that I read but didn't answer. She wanted forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. She'd stood by while my father documented my childhood as a series of contractual failures. She'd told me to try harder instead of protecting me. Her regret now didn't erase 9 years of complicity. I graduated valedictorian despite everything, or maybe because of everything. My speech talked about pressure and expectations and the difference between healthy challenge and destructive perfectionism. I didn't mention my father directly, but everyone knew what I was really talking about. Leo's parents sat in the audience cheering louder than anyone when I walked across the stage. My parents weren't there. The restraining order Judge Pennington had issued as part of the custody ruling prevented them from attending school events. I collected my diploma and felt something unlock in my chest. I'd achieved the perfect grades my father demanded, but for the first time, they were mine. Not his, not the contracts. Mine. I went to college across the country, deliberately choosing distance from everything that had happened. My roommate freshman year was a guy named Julian, who was smart but relaxed about grades, who studied enough but also knew how to have fun. He introduced me to his friend group, pulled me out of my room when I studied too long, taught me that B's and even C's weren't catastrophes, but just part of learning. Slowly, very slowly, I started to believe him. I joined an intramural soccer team. I went to concerts and parties. I dated someone who thought my occasional academic stress was normal student anxiety, not the echoes of systematic abuse. I was learning to be a person instead of a contract. Therapy helped. My college counselor, Dr. Amara Singh, specialized in family trauma and helped me understand that my father's behavior wasn't about my grades, but about his need for control. Abusers often use legitimate-sounding frameworks to justify their actions, she explained. Your father used contract law and academic excellence as cover for manipulation. That made it harder to recognize as abuse because it looked like parenting. She taught me that healing wasn't linear, that I'd have setbacks, that the voice in my head calculating penalties for mistakes would take years to silence. She was right. Some days I still heard my father's voice analyzing my performance. Some days I still felt phantom pressure to be perfect. But those days grew less frequent. My father tried to contact me once during sophomore year. An email arrived from an address I didn't recognize, explaining that he'd completed his court-ordered parenting courses, that he understood now how his methods had been harmful, that he wanted to rebuild our relationship. He asked if we could meet for coffee during my winter break. I forwarded the email to Dr. Singh, who helped me compose a response. I wrote that I wasn't ready for contact, that I needed more time, that any future relationship would require genuine accountability beyond court-ordered courses. I didn't hear from him again. My mother sent birthday cards that I sometimes opened and sometimes didn't. She'd divorced my father and moved to another state. Too little, too late. I changed my major from pre-law to education. I'd spent years thinking I'd become a lawyer because that's what my father had mapped out for me, what his contract had been preparing me for. But working with kids during a volunteer tutoring program showed me what I actually wanted. I wanted to help students who were struggling, who were pressured, who'd been convinced their worth depended on perfect grades. I wanted to be the adult I'd needed when I was 8 years old, signing a contract I didn't understand. I graduated college with a teaching certificate and job offers from 3 different schools. I chose the one in the district with the highest rates of academic pressure, where students needed someone who understood that perfect grades weren't worth destroying your childhood. My first student who reminded me of myself was a 6th grader named Amy, whose parents had her in tutoring 7 days a week. She was exhausted and anxious and convinced she was failing despite having straight A's. I pulled her aside after class one day and asked if she was okay. She started crying and told me about the schedule her parents had created, the expectations they'd set, the way they reviewed every assignment for mistakes. I called her parents in for a conference. They were surprised when I told them their daughter was showing signs of anxiety and burnout. But she's doing so well, her mother said. We're just supporting her success. I explained the difference between support and pressure, between healthy expectations and destructive perfectionism. I told them what I'd learned the hard way. That same year, I testified at a state education committee hearing about academic pressure and student mental health. I told my story about the contract, the remediation files, the demand letter. I explained how my father had weaponized achievement into abuse, how the culture of perfectionism that dominated elite schools created opportunities for manipulation. The committee chair thanked me for my testimony and said they'd consider reforms to address student stress. I didn't know if anything would change, but at least I'd spoken up. At least I'd turned my trauma into something potentially useful. 10 years after signing that contract, I got married to someone who'd never known the robot version of me. Elena was a social worker who understood trauma and healing, who didn't care that I'd been valedictorian, who loved the person I'd become rather than the perfect student I'd been trained to be. We talked about having kids someday, about what kind of parents we'd want to be. No contracts, I said, half joking. No performance reviews or remediation files. Elena took my hand. Just love and patience and teaching them that mistakes are how people learn. At our wedding, Leo gave a toast about friendship surviving everything, about the kid who'd been too busy studying to come to birthday parties finally learning to live. I cried through the whole speech. My father sent a card when I got married. Inside was a brief note saying he was proud of me and wished me well. No apology, no real acknowledgement of what he'd done, just a polite greeting you'd send to a distant relative. I showed it to Elena, who asked if I wanted to respond. I thought about it for a week before deciding. I wrote back one sentence. I forgive you, but I don't want a relationship. I sent it and felt lighter. Forgiveness wasn't about him deserving it. It was about me releasing the weight I'd been carrying since I was 8 years old, signing my name in careful block letters, believing my father's love was contingent on perfect grades. I'd spent years learning that love doesn't come with contracts, that families shouldn't operate as litigation waiting to happen, that childhood is supposed to include mistakes and growth and grace. Now I was teaching those lessons to students who needed them. The contract had been destroyed years ago by court order, but I'd finally destroyed its power over me. I was free, actually, and completely free, living a life my 8-year-old self couldn't have imagined. That was the real victory. Not perfect grades or validating my father's methods, but building something entirely different, something healthy and genuine and mine. The lawsuit never happened. The breach was forgiven. The child grew up despite everything. Justice arrived slowly but absolutely, delivered not through legal victory but through the life I built after escaping. Some endings aren't dramatic. Some are just quiet relief and a future finally my own. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.